Hello everyone, I'm Laura Gardner and I did my presentation on community violence and how this impacts families and children. Community violence is when a person is exposed to intentional acts of interpersonal violence that's committed in public areas. The person can not necessarily be related to the victim. Examples are bullying, gang fights, shooting, any type of altercation, any type of physical violence. Families that are in violent communities have increased fears and thoughts that harm is going to come at any point. This increases their anxieties, fight or flight response, PTSD. Community violence is an intentional attempt to hurt someone. These include homicide, sexual assaults, robberies, and use of weapons. It is defined as a deliberate act and intended to cause physical harm against a person or persons in the community. Who is affected by community violence? This can occur throughout any ethnic or racial group. However, it is shown that African American youth are disproportionately affected. Males generally report more community violence exposure than females. The majority of research on chronic community violence focuses on those most directly impacted. These would be the ethnic minorities, impoverished, and crime-ridden communities. In studies, it is shown that over 80% of the children living in urban areas have witnessed community violence in many forms. As many as 70% of those children report that they are the victim of the actual act of violence. Youth in the inner cities are more apt to be exposed to community violence than those in middle or upper social economic classes. 40% of those children also reported witnessing a shooting. The history of community violence, this information was obtained from the CDC. Over 30 years ago, violence and health were hardly used in the same sentence. Homicide and suicide reached very high numbers in the 1980s, and this included the youth and minority populations in the United States. Since 1965, suicide and homicide rates have been in the top 15 causes of death. Since the United States became so successful in treating and preventing diseases, such as with the vaccinations, the tuberculosis, measles outbreak, once all of that was kind of under control, that's when they saw the increase and saw all of these things from suicide and homicides that were happening. Another development was the increasing acceptance in the public health community of the importance of behavioral factors in the prevention of disease. There were 5 objectives for the nation to promote health and to prevent disease. These are the number of child abuse, injuries, and death, the rate of homicide among Black males ages 15 to 24 years old, suicide rate among 15 to 24-year-olds, number of privately owned guns, improvements in the reliability on data on child abuse and family violence. In 1983, the CDC established the Violent Epidemiology Branch, and this then added the Division of Injury, Epidemiology, and Control. By the 1990s, the CDC published the Prevention of Youth Violence, a framework for community action, and they had many methods to identify risk factors of violence. Risk factors are examples of these include rigid social beliefs about what is masculine and feminine, lack of job opportunities, and family conflict. These things make it more likely that people will experience violence. Protective factors, on the other hand, are things that people are less likely to experience violence and increase their resilience when they are faced with the risk factors previously discussed. Examples of these are connections to caring adults or access to mental health services. Having many positive activities, positive things for youth to do, decrease the chances of community violence happening. The framework for community action outlined the steps that are needed to implement and approach the violence prevention of youth. Early success in youth violence prevention assisted the path for the approach on issues of partner violence, sexual violence, and child maltreatment. In 1994, Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act. The CDC also worked to understand violence, and this was describing the problem of homicide and suicide, the cause of death, to monitor public health objectives for homicide and suicide, examine characteristics of different types of homicide, characterize homicide as a cause of death in the workplace, describe patterns of homicide and suicide victimization in the minority populations among children. They started to study physical child abuse, and they wanted to quantify the risk of homicide and suicide associated with the access to having firearms. In 1999, the CDC published Best Practices of Youth Violence Prevention. This is the source book for community action. In 2000, WHO created the Department of Injuries and Violence Prevention. In 2001, the U.S. Surgeon General released a report on the knowledge of youth violence and prevention. Then the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention was released. They received the first congressional appropriations of child maltreatment prevention. Then in 2002, the National Violent Death Reporting System had been established. In 2006, the CDC launched the Choose Respect, which is a communication initiative to help prevent unhealthy relationships. This kind of gave skills on how to maintain positive communication, help them understand the positive aspects of a relationship. This was to help decrease domestic violence, sexual assault, etc. In 2007, the CDC published a study to find information on medical and productivity related to the cost of violence. Over the years, they have found many impacts of community violence and how they affect children and families. Low-income urban youth are at risk for a range of co-occurring emotional and behavioral symptoms and poor psychosocial functioning. Disruptive behavior problems and aggression are central features. The community violence exposure of African Americans and Hispanic male children have been linked to increased aggressive behavior. This also leads to conduct behaviors, which are the conduct disorder, behavior, and emotional disorder presented as repetitive, disruptive, and violent behaviors in the person, and also oppositional defiant behaviors. In this disorder is when a child displays argumentative behaviors towards people in authority. There have been extensive evidence showing the relationship between community violence and externalizing behaviors. Bronfenbrenner's ecological model emphasizes the role of community influence on development. The lack of social organizations might result in the breaking of rules, so it's very important that the kids have positive supports and activities in their communities. Violent communities limit opportunities to learn law-abiding behaviors. Many times there aren't, whether it's the activities, even a YMCA, jobs. There's a lot of things that kind of leave the community once it is established as an unsafe place. So that leaves only the people committing the crimes and the violence to be the role models for the children in the community. Horn and Trickett concluded that it may not be a contradiction that children's exposure to violence is related to externalizing aggression and internalizing anxiety and affective behavior problems. This would mean that people are more apt to, when they're anxious or depressed, to have behavior problems, they're going to act in an aggressive manner because they don't have positive coping skills to deal with the internal feelings that they're having. Studies have shown that aggressive children tend to be hypersensitive to cues of threat, selectively attend to aggressive cues and overlook other situational factors that may have influenced their behaviors. Many times they aren't identifying their triggers of aggression and their warning signs to decrease the acts of violence that come from their internal feelings. The impacts of community violence continued. Community violence can lead to depressive symptoms and anxiety. As discussed before, it leads to aggression. Can also lead to substance use of any kind. 2 studies show that both males and females have similar numbers of post-traumatic stress symptoms that follow exposure to violent acts. Studies have shown that girls report more internalizing. These are the anxiety, depression, and general emotional distress symptoms that are associated with this exposure than boys. So boys are the ones that are more acting in the aggressive manners. Community violence can create fear in the home and cause conflict between family members. Causing an aggression in the family can lead to children and youth involvement or legal involvement. Parent conflicts come and are increased when they're living in an unsafe neighborhood. The parents may not have the ability to meet the basic needs of the family, and this can cause more stress. Parents worrying about the violence in the community adds stressors. So this keeps the parents heightened, and this can make more conflicts arise between families. There has been a lot of research on services to kind of help with the issue. The first I'm going to talk about is school-based treatment and preventative interventions that are needed for children that are at risk for exposure to community violence. The effects can impair their ability to function developmentally appropriately and achieve academic success. There are community and school-based programs in areas. They are able to meet with the youth while they are in school, in the community, can also meet with parents, with the teachers, to kind of get an understanding of the concerns and work through any of the developmentally, emotional, or academic issues that the child may be having. Another project that I researched was the Truth in Trauma project. This is on a micro level. This program wants to engage the youth through empowerment to gain positive youth development. Workers that are empathetic and trauma-informed can understand the impact of trauma on these children and are able to work with them in a positive manner. They help the youth learn positive aspects from adult mentors to teach independent responsibility, autonomy, and accountability. They provide trauma-informed practice, psychoeducation on the emotions and the backgrounds, maybe of their diagnosis, and their restorative practice.